Everyone keeps acting like I should have seen it coming, but they have no idea what it feels like to stand outside your own apartment at midnight with nothing but a trash bag of clothes and a handwritten note that destroys your entire understanding of the person you thought you knew and loved. The rain started falling just as I reached the front door of the apartment building I'd called home for 2 years, the place where Derek and I had built what I thought was a solid, loving relationship based on trust, communication, and genuine partnership. I was exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the evening, but also feeling oddly empowered and confident about the choice I'd made to finally explore. The sexual curiosity that had been building inside me for months. I'd spent the evening with someone I'd met through a dating app, someone who understood that this was just physical experimentation rather than any kind of emotional betrayal of my relationship with Derek. It had been exactly what I'd hoped for: exciting, liberating, and completely separate from the deep emotional connection I shared with the man I planned to spend the rest of my life with. The whole experience had felt like proof that Derek and I had the kind of mature, secure relationship that could handle temporary physical exploration without threatening the foundation of love and commitment we'd spent 2 years building together. But when I tried to put my key in the lock, it wouldn't turn. The key that had worked perfectly when I'd left the apartment 6 hours earlier was suddenly useless, like it belonged to a different building entirely. I stood there for several minutes, trying different angles and wondering if something was wrong with the lock mechanism, before I noticed the folded piece of paper taped to our door with my name written on it in Derek's careful handwriting. The note was brief but devastating. "Try someone else, but not under my roof." As those words sank in, I looked around and spotted the trash bag sitting by the curb, a black garbage bag that I gradually realized was filled with my belongings. My clothes, toiletries, books, and personal items had been hastily packed and left outside like discarded garbage rather than the possessions of someone who'd been living there as an equal partner for 2 years. The cruel efficiency of Derek's response hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been out exploring what I thought was harmless sexual curiosity, he'd been systematically removing me from our shared life and preparing to lock me out of the apartment that had been our home together. This wasn't an impulsive reaction to hurt feelings or temporary anger about my choice to sleep with someone else. This was Derek making a calculated decision to end our relationship in the most humiliating and devastating way possible, leaving me literally homeless at midnight as punishment for pursuing something I genuinely believed he'd come to accept and understand. 3 weeks earlier, Derek and I had been having one of our usual cozy evenings at home, sharing a bottle of wine while watching some documentary about modern relationships and alternative marriage arrangements. It was exactly the kind of intimate, intellectual evening that had always made me feel lucky to be with someone who was thoughtful, open-minded, and willing to explore complex topics rather than just defaulting to traditional assumptions about love and commitment. The documentary had featured several couples who'd experimented with open marriages, polyamory, and various forms of consensual non-monogamy, presenting these arrangements as potentially healthy alternatives to conventional relationship structures for people who were secure enough to handle them. Watching these couples discuss their experiences with such honesty and sophistication made me feel curious about whether Derek and I might be missing out on something by adhering to traditional monogamy without ever questioning whether it was really the best choice for our particular relationship. So I decided to bring up the topic in what I thought was a playful, exploratory way, asking Derek whether he thought it might be kind of empowering for me to try being with someone else just once, purely as a way of understanding my own sexuality and desires more completely. Derek chuckled and brushed off the suggestion, which I initially interpreted as him needing time to process such an unconventional idea rather than him rejecting it outright. But I kept thinking about the couples in the documentary and how confident and liberated they seemed compared to people who'd never explored beyond their first serious relationships. Over the next few days, I kept bringing up the topic in different ways, trying to help Derek understand that I wasn't suggesting anything that would threaten our relationship or indicate dissatisfaction with him personally. I emphasized that this would be purely physical experimentation, completely separate from the emotional intimacy and commitment we shared together. But the conversation that ultimately set everything in motion happened about a week later, when I told Derek that if he really loved me, he'd trust me enough to try being with someone else once, just to satisfy my curiosity and help me feel like a more complete, experienced person. I framed it as a test of our relationship's strength and his confidence in my love for him. If he was secure in our connection and truly believed that I was committed to him above all others, then one night of physical experimentation with someone else shouldn't feel threatening or problematic. The logic seemed perfectly sound to me at the time. Jealousy and possessiveness were signs of insecurity and immaturity, while the willingness to support your partner's growth and exploration demonstrated true love and emotional evolution. But Derek's reaction was completely different from what I'd expected. Instead of engaging with my reasoning or expressing his own feelings about the proposal, he just went silent, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. When I pressed him for a response, he simply nodded and said he'd think about it, but his tone was flat and distant in a way that made me realize I'd touched on something much more sensitive than I'd anticipated. In the days following our conversation about me sleeping with someone else, Derek became increasingly distant and withdrawn, responding to my attempts at affection and intimacy with politeness rather than the warmth and enthusiasm that had always characterized our relationship. I interpreted his behavior as evidence that he was struggling with insecurity and jealousy, probably wrestling with societal conditioning about monogamy and possession that prevented him from embracing the more enlightened approach to relationships that I was proposing. Rather than backing down or giving him space to process his feelings, I decided to keep pushing the conversation, convinced that with enough discussion and reassurance, I could help him understand that my desire to experiment with someone else was actually evidence of how secure and committed our relationship was. I talked to my friends about Derek's reaction, describing him as too traditional and conservative to handle the kind of sexual liberation that modern, progressive women were embracing. Several of them agreed that his possessiveness was a red flag, evidence that he didn't truly respect my autonomy and right to make decisions about my own body and experiences. These conversations reinforced my belief that I was being reasonable and mature, while Derek was allowing outdated ideas about female sexuality to make him controlling and possessive in ways that were ultimately harmful to our relationship. One evening, about 2 weeks after I'd first brought up the topic, I tried again to help Derek understand my perspective by explaining that he was my forever person, but that maybe I needed a little more experience before we got married and settled into lifelong monogamy. I emphasized that this wasn't about him being inadequate or unsatisfying, but about me wanting to feel confident that I was choosing him from a place of knowledge rather than just accepting the first serious relationship I'd ever had. Derek's response was the same unnaturally calm nod he'd been giving me throughout these conversations, but this time there was something in his eyes that should have warned me that he'd reached some kind of internal decision about our relationship, and my repeated requests for permission to cheat on him. But I was so focused on my own desires and justifications that I completely missed the signs that Derek was preparing to end our relationship rather than continuing to negotiate about my sexual experimentation with other people. Finally, after weeks of what I thought were productive conversations about opening our relationship, I decided to take decisive action and show Derek that my desire to sleep with someone else was serious, rather than just theoretical exploration. I told him directly that I was going to do it, spend one night with someone else, and that afterward, he'd see that it would actually bring us closer together rather than creating problems between us. Derek stared at me for a long moment before asking if I was sure that was what I wanted, his tone so neutral and controlled that I interpreted it as him finally accepting what I'd been trying to explain for weeks about the benefits of sexual exploration. I told him that yes, I needed this for me and for us, that it was something I had to do in order to feel like a complete person who was choosing him freely, rather than just settling for the only serious relationship I'd ever experienced. That night, I dressed carefully in my best outfit and went out to meet someone I'd been talking to online, someone who understood that this was a one-time experiment rather than the beginning of an ongoing affair or emotional connection. The evening went exactly as I'd hoped. It was exciting and liberating without being emotionally significant, proving to me that physical intimacy and emotional commitment were completely separate things that didn't have to threaten each other in a mature, secure relationship. I returned home at 2 a.m. feeling confident and empowered, ready to share with Derek how right I'd been about this experience strengthening rather than weakening our bond. Instead, I found myself locked out of our apartment with all my belongings packed in a trash bag and a note that made it clear Derek had been planning this response throughout our weeks of conversation about opening our relationship. The immediate aftermath of being locked out of my own home was a blur of shock, panic, and desperate attempts to reach Derek through phone calls and text messages that went unanswered and undelivered as I gradually realized he'd blocked me on every platform we'd used to communicate. I had to call my friend Sarah at 2:30 in the morning to ask if I could crash on her couch, explaining through tears and humiliation that Derek had kicked me out for sleeping with someone else, though I was careful to frame it as his overreaction to my reasonable desire for sexual exploration rather than acknowledging any fault in my own behavior. Sarah was sympathetic, but also clearly uncomfortable with the situation, especially when I started ranting about Derek's immaturity and inability to handle a truly progressive relationship structure. Her responses became increasingly non-committal as I described the weeks of conversations leading up to my decision to sleep with someone else, and I could tell she was forming her own opinions about my role in destroying the relationship. Over the next few days, word about the breakup spread through our social circle in ways that made me realize Derek's version of events was quite different from the narrative I'd been telling myself and others about our mature discussions regarding open relationships. According to mutual friends who'd spoken with Derek, he'd spent weeks listening to me pressure him into accepting my desire to cheat on him, using emotional manipulation and accusations about his insecurity to wear down his resistance to something he'd never wanted or agreed to. From Derek's perspective, I hadn't been proposing a mutual exploration of open relationship dynamics. I'd been demanding permission to have an affair while threatening to judge his love and commitment based on his willingness to accept my betrayal. The friends who'd initially seemed supportive of my position started distancing themselves as they learned more details about how I'd approached the situation, particularly my repeated insistence that Derek's reluctance was evidence of possessiveness and emotional immaturity rather than legitimate relationship boundaries. The most devastating blow came when I discovered that Derek had posted a cryptic TikTok video with the caption, "Some people want open doors until they get kicked through one," which went semi-viral among our extended social network and became a source of endless humiliation as people shared it with commentary about my situation. The video didn't mention me by name or provide explicit details about our breakup, but everyone who knew us could connect the dots, and the comments were filled with people expressing admiration for Derek's clever response to what they saw as my attempts to manipulate him into accepting infidelity. My attempts to reach Derek through mutual friends were unsuccessful, as he'd apparently made it clear to everyone that he considered our relationship completely over and had no interest in further communication or attempts at reconciliation. The practical consequences of the breakup were almost as devastating as the emotional ones. Derek's name had been on the lease for our apartment, which meant I had no legal right to continue living there or reclaim any of the shared possessions we'd accumulated during our 2 years together. I had to start completely over at age 26, finding a new place to live, replacing furniture and household items, and rebuilding a social life that had been largely centered around our relationship and mutual friends who were now treating me like a pariah. 6 weeks after Derek kicked me out, I saw him at our favorite coffee shop, sitting across from a stunningly beautiful woman who was clearly his new girlfriend. They looked comfortable and happy together, sharing intimate conversation and displaying the kind of easy affection that Derek and I had once shared before I'd destroyed everything with my demands for sexual exploration. The sight of them together hit me like a physical blow. This woman was everything I wasn't: refined, elegant, clearly confident in ways that didn't require constant validation or boundary pushing to feel secure. She was laughing at something Derek had said, her hand resting naturally on his arm, in a gesture of genuine intimacy that I suddenly realized I'd been incapable of providing during our relationship. My first instinct was to approach their table and create some kind of dramatic confrontation, to make Derek explain his cruel treatment of me and justify his decision to end our 2-year relationship over one night of harmless experimentation. But as I walked toward their table, Derek looked up and saw me coming. Instead of seeming uncomfortable or guilty, he smiled calmly, stood up from his chair, and walked over to meet me halfway. His voice was quiet but clear when he thanked me for setting him free, explaining that my insistence on sleeping with someone else had helped him realize that we wanted fundamentally different things from relationships and that ending things cleanly had been the best decision for both of us. The words were delivered without anger or vindictiveness, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that my behavior had revealed incompatibilities that made our relationship unsustainable. He wasn't trying to hurt me or get revenge. He was simply stating the truth about what my actions had taught him about my character and priorities. Before I could respond with any of the accusations or justifications I'd been preparing, Derek returned to his table, gathered his things, and left the coffee shop with his new girlfriend, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the cafe while other customers stared and whispered about the obvious drama that had just unfolded. The humiliation of that moment was compounded by the realization that Derek had moved on completely, not just romantically, but emotionally. He wasn't carrying anger or resentment about what I'd done. He'd simply processed the experience and used it to find someone who shared his values around commitment and loyalty. Watching him walk away with someone who clearly appreciated what he had to offer made me understand that the problem hadn't been his inability to evolve or embrace progressive relationship structures. The problem had been my inability to recognize that not everyone defines love and commitment the same way, and that pressuring someone to accept your definition isn't progressive, it's manipulative. The humiliation of that moment forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my behavior and the real reasons Derek had chosen to end our relationship so decisively, rather than working through our problems with communication and compromise. Looking back honestly at our conversations about opening our relationship, I could see that I'd been manipulative and demanding rather than genuinely exploring mutual interests in alternative relationship structures. I'd used Derek's love for me as a weapon against him, suggesting that his discomfort with my desire to cheat was evidence that he didn't really love me or trust our connection enough to handle my sexual exploration with other people. The repeated conversations where I'd pushed and pressured him to accept something he clearly didn't want had been emotionally abusive rather than the mature, progressive discussions I'd convinced myself they were. Every time Derek had expressed reluctance or discomfort, I'd responded by questioning his emotional maturity, his security, his commitment to our relationship. I'd made him the problem for having normal human responses to his partner's desire to be intimate with other people. The friends I'd complained to about Derek's possessiveness had probably seen through my narrative more clearly than I'd realized. When I described him as too traditional or conservative, they'd likely heard a woman trying to justify pressuring her partner into accepting something he fundamentally didn't want. Derek's calm, calculated response to my ultimatum had been him recognizing that I was someone who would continue pushing boundaries and making demands that prioritized my own desires over his comfort and the health of our relationship. By sleeping with someone else despite his obvious reluctance and discomfort, I'd proven that I was willing to violate his trust and boundaries whenever my personal desires conflicted with his needs, making me unsuitable as a long-term partner for someone who valued loyalty and mutual respect. The trash bag full of my belongings hadn't been cruel punishment. It had been Derek protecting himself from further manipulation and boundary violations by someone who'd shown she couldn't be trusted to prioritize their relationship over her own. Immediate gratification, During those weeks of sleeping on Sarah's couch, I'd had plenty of time to think about what had really happened between Derek and me, and gradually, I began to see patterns in my behavior that extended far beyond our conversations about opening our relationship. I'd always been someone who pushed boundaries, who tested limits, who demanded that people prove their love for me by accepting behavior that made them uncomfortable. With Derek, this tendency had manifested as sexual demands, but in previous relationships it had taken other forms: emotional manipulation, jealousy tests, creating drama to see how much someone would tolerate. The progressive language I'd used to justify my desire to sleep with someone else had been a sophisticated way of doing what I'd always done, making my partner responsible for my happiness while positioning any resistance as evidence of their inadequacy or immaturity. Derek had probably spent months watching me push smaller boundaries, testing his responses, gradually escalating my demands, while wrapping them in language about trust, security, and emotional evolution. The open relationship conversation hadn't been the beginning of problems in our relationship. It had been the culmination of a pattern where I consistently prioritized my own needs over his comfort while making him feel guilty for having normal human reactions to boundary violations. The woman I'd seen him with at the coffee shop represented everything I hadn't been capable of being. Someone who could love Derek without constantly testing that love. Someone who could be satisfied with exclusive commitment rather than always demanding more proof of devotion. Standing in that coffee shop, watching Derek walk away with someone who probably respected his boundaries and valued his feelings, I finally understood that my demand for sexual exploration hadn't been progressive or empowering. It had been selfish and destructive, prioritizing my own curiosity over the emotional well-being of someone who'd loved me completely. Derek had been right to protect himself by ending our relationship cleanly and completely. I'd shown him who I really was through my demands and manipulation, and he'd been wise enough to believe me rather than hoping I would change or grow into someone capable of the kind of love he deserved. The silence in my new studio apartment wasn't just the absence of Derek's voice. It was the sound of consequences for treating someone's boundaries as obstacles to overcome, rather than expressions of their deepest values about love and commitment. Commitment, 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 commitment.